Assalamualaikum.
Wa
Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. You mentioned the community of resistance in South Africa, and I was wondering what ways of resisting without falling into like political labels, and there are, and if you could like recommend how to be political in this messy world and stay to the not losing oneself and staying to the way of Tasauf, and if there are like recommendations and specific things about this community also.
It's a really good question. I'm glad that I get asked this question in Kuala Lumpur and not in Cairo, so I can maybe not have to worry about anyone coming through the door. So, I mean, two things. One, South Africa is a very different place now. Apartheid, alhamdulillah, was dismantled, even though the effects of it remain in certain ways, but the system was removed. So the way in which the sheikhs of the Zawiya, going not just to these particular generations of mashayikh, and Sheikh Siraj, this was something else that appealed to me about him, he was actually thrown in jail for protesting against apartheid. When I heard that, I was just like, that's my guy. Sheikh Ahmed was not like that. Sheikh Ahmed was far more reserved, actually, his brother. They're both khulafa. And other teachers of the Zawiya tried to keep a distance as much as possible from being embroiled in political affairs, while they trained people to be prepared, right? So someone like Imam Abdullah Harun, he studied with the same tradition in Mecca. And Imam Abdullah Harun wasn't a Hendrix. Okay, it's a completely different family, but he studied in that same tradition in Mecca, and he was a very prominent anti-apartheid leader. He was imprisoned and he died in jail. And it's narrated, and this is mass narration, that the day of his funeral there was an earthquake, the likes of which nobody had ever seen in living memory in Cape Town. That's just a fact, it's not like 200 or 300 years ago, we're talking about the 60s. And this, people took that as a sign. Now, it is a very messy world, and maybe without talking about particularly Sheikh Siraj Ahmed, Sheikh Siraj did get thrown in jail. I will say that when he did, he was actually a student in Mecca at the time, and I think he was back for a vacation. Whether or not the sheikhs would openly protest when they become sheikhs, I don't know. But certainly they had a number of people who were part of the anti-apartheid movement very closely connected to them in the Zawiya. I know that because I know some of them. Okay, but that's a particular training, I suppose, that people receive. But if I want to give you some examples of maybe more contemporary things, and you should be advised, you're talking to, yes, I'm half English, but I'm also an Egyptian. And I lived through the uprising in 2011. I lived through the revolutionary period between 2011 and 2013, and the mess thereafter. So you shouldn't take my words as gospel. Said Ashraf will tell you when you put two Egyptians into the room, you'll find 4 different opinions. It's just the way that they are, usually very loudly. But there was one man in Egypt that really represented a lot in terms of my understanding of that kind of teaching. His name was Sheikh Imad Affat. He was very interesting because Sheikh Imad was what we call Amin al-Fatwa. Okay, Amin al-Fatwa Dar al-Ifta al-Masriya. So he was, the custodian of religious verdicts at the House of Religious Verdicts. And House of Religious Verdicts, i.e. Dar al-Ifta. Dar al-Ifta is actually a government institution. It's part of the Ministry of Justice. And Sheikh Imad was a mufti he wasn't the Grand Mufti. The Grand Mufti was Ali Gum'a. which is important to know. But he was a very prominent sheikh in the Dar. And when the protests began in 2011, Sheikh Ahmed went to the square. He went to Tahrir Square in Cairo and he protested. Now, I will say when he did protest, I didn't see him because in the midst of that crowd, he wasn't dressed in his Azhari garb, okay, which is very prominent. And I remember clearly that there were a group of Azhari ulama who had all congregated together in a particular part of the square, and I saw them. I even took a video of them. Sheikh Ahmed wasn't like that. He went in, very quote unquote normal clothes. Very muhtaram, very respectable, but he wasn't dressed like a sheikh. And I suppose he did so because he didn't want to make it seem as though he was representing the Azhari institution by doing so. But no one was in any doubt that he believed that religiously this was something that he had to do. And he never quit Dar al-Ifta. He did not leave that government position, that he still went to the square. And thereafter, he actually took a number of quite blatant positions. So a friend of mine was in his office when the phone rang, and there was a police officer on the other end of the line. And the police officer was asking if it was religiously permissible to shoot protesters with deadly force. And Sheikh Ahmed was so insistent that under no circumstances may you do so. Haram, haram, haram. That was Sheikh Ahmed. Sheikh Ahmed was killed at the end of 2011 by the security forces. In the midst of clashes. I shouldn't call them clashes. Clashes imply that there were two sides with arms. It wasn't two sides with arms. Rahmatullah alayh. He never quit his job. He never left Dar al-Ifta al-Masriya. So one can't make the assumption that he thought that being in that sort of institution was forbidden, because otherwise he would have left. But he certainly felt that this was not a partisan issue. Okay, that this was a national issue. And you see that sort of approach with others in different turuq. When I was in that square, I knew that there were murids of turuq in that square. And I knew that awrad were being read and adhkar were being recited. I knew that. But they didn't go as the tariqah. And I'm quite happy that they didn't. Because then it makes the tariqah or the religious institution into something that's very partisan, and it's not necessary to be done in such a way. Ironically, have any of you heard of the group Hizb al-Tahrir? Yeah? So, I thought people in Egypt might have as well, but for some reason some Sufi tariqah decided to actually found a political party after 2011, and they called it Hizb al-Tahrir. I have no idea what they were thinking. But that was a model that I would not have thought was very sensible, because you're bringing in a strange type of identity politics, mixing it in with the tariqah like that, which I wouldn't think is very good. And in our history, we find many examples of people very committed to the tradition, very committed to Tasauf, and involving themselves in a political manner, but not a political manner that, again, as I term, partisan. So, Sidi Omar al-Mukhtar, for example, that's a national cause. That's fighting Italian fascism and trying to rid the Libyans of that occupation. He was a murid of Sidi Ahmed al-Sharif al-Sunusi of the Tariqa Sunusiyya, for example, right? Which Sayyid Muhammad bin Ali al-Maliki has a line from. In fact, one of the most common awrad is the wird or the tahleel, the declaration of faith of Sidi Ahmed ibn Idris, and that comes straight via the Idrisiyya of Sidi Ahmed ibn Idris. So you had the Sunusis, you had, I'm sure, in this part of the world, people from Turuq engaging in political activity. I don't know enough about. I spent 2 years here. As was mentioned, Sayyid Muhammad Naqib al-Attas is one of my teachers. but I would have loved to have researched more about this part of the world, especially beyond, just where I was living at the time. But you saw that in Nigeria, you saw that in West Africa, you saw that with a number of different members of the Shadiliya, of the Naqshbandis and the Qadiris in Central Asia. And I don't believe they ever viewed this as being partisan. I think they believed it to be something that was, quote-unquote, a national duty. I will say that not everybody looks at it like that. And I will say that there are others who regard A, partisanship not to be a big deal, and B, to make apologies for oppression, and in some cases, support it. It's not the tradition we were taught. And something that personally I find rejected. But I feel obliged to put it out there so that everybody realizes that, people have different points of views on these sorts of things. Does that answer your question? Inshallah. Tawfiq, inshallah.